Hello there. My name is Thomas, and this is Alvin. And we're here at the Hoy Creek in Coquitlam, BC to watch the annual salmon run. You may be familiar with salmon as a food, like in sushi. But did you know that salmon provide a huge number of cultural and ecosystem services? Salmon, like Alvin here, are one of the most important species in BC, and humans and salmon have had a relationship in these territories since time immemorial. And that relationship has changed a lot with new technologies and changing narratives throughout history. But this begs the question, how are salmon populations affected by this relationship in BC? That's what we're going to be focusing on today. Specifically, why are salmon so important? And how do human technologies, including indigenous fishing technologies and settler hatcheries, affect the sizes and diversity of salmon populations in BC? So join me and Alvin as we watch the salmon go by on today's episode of
Science with Thomas.
Part 1.
Importance of salmon.
Pacific salmon are of the genus Oncorhynchus, of which there are 7 species in BC. Here at Hoy Creek, we have chum and coho, depending on the time of the year. Salmon are a kind of anadromous fish, meaning that they are born in freshwater streams, migrate out to the ocean as juveniles, spend 2 to 4 years out there as adults, then return to their natal streams when they're ready to spawn. And amazingly, a single female salmon can lay thousands of eggs, but only about a quarter of them actually hatch, and only 1 to 5% of those that do hatch return as adults to spawn. This is due to predation, competition, and other factors. This means that salmon are a strongly R-selected species with a type 3 survivorship curve. This is because they lay lots of eggs and they grow very quickly, but not many of them survive. Here at the Hoy Creek hatchery, 55,000 chum fry are hatched each year, but in 2022, only 376 were counted that returned. So why are salmon so important ecologically? You see, all species need nitrogen to survive, to make structures and proteins. But all the nitrogen in the atmosphere is not usable by most species, and so plants and animals need to get their nitrogen from somewhere else. In coastal forests, salmon, full of biologically available nitrogen, are eaten by bears, eagles, and other predators. This allows them to get nitrogen. The parts that they don't eat, though, they leave on the ground, which decomposers then use. And then nitrogen can enter the soil and support the plant community, which supports the bats and the insects and everyone else in the ecosystem. Furthermore, the plant community provides habitats for many bird and mammal species, which makes this interaction web even more complex. Tree shadows can even cool the stream temperatures, creating more suitable places for salmon to lay their eggs. And so almost the entire ecosystem, from trees to ducks to herons to squirrels, they all heavily rely on the salmon returning. And you can see and smell this nitrogen cycling occurring with all of these decomposing salmon all over the place. Salmon also provide other services to humans, including cultural significance. For many First Nations communities, salmon are a dietary staple. They are caught in the fall during the annual salmon run, then smoked and stored as a food source during the winter. They are also valuable trade items and essential to indigenous economies. The BC commercial salmon industry is worth about $30 million too. And so clearly, salmon are important for a variety of reasons. But how do humans and salmon actually interact? How do we catch and rear them? And how have technologies changed over time?
Part 2.
Technologies and histories.
Since time immemorial, indigenous communities such as the Coquitlam Nation have lived on these lands, and First Nations have many technologies for catching salmon. First, the fish weir. Weirs are large fences that span the entire river that guide salmon into a trap where they can be easily caught. They're opened at night to ensure that communities further upstream still get enough salmon, and they've been used for at least 5,000 years. Tidal traps are also used, which use the flow of the tides. During high tide, the salmon can easily swim over the stone wall, but during low tide, they get trapped and can easily be caught. Or consider the fish wheel. Like a Ferris wheel for fish, they use the flow of the stream to scoop up fish and then drop them off into a basket just offshore. In the early 1900s, many of these indigenous technologies were banned under the Indian Act, and settler fishing techniques started to develop. With more and more salmon being caught, and with habitats starting to degrade because of the gold rush, hatcheries were introduced. The idea with hatcheries was to collect eggs from spawning salmon and incubate and raise them. This was to increase the number of eggs that hatch, protect fry from predators, and then release them once they're a little bit larger. Hatcheries can keep track of which salmon they raise by cutting off the adipose fin. That's this one right here. Then, when they return as adults, they can tell which ones are wild and which ones are hatchery raised. In 1977, the Salmonid Enhancement Program, or SEP, was introduced in Canada because the demand for salmon kept growing and growing. And since 1988, more than 5 billion salmon are released from hatcheries each year between Canada, the US, Russia, Japan, and Korea. So yay, more salmon. But not so fast though. How many of these salmon actually survive out in the ocean? And are there any negative consequences of hatcheries on wild populations?
Part 3.
Effects on salmon populations.
In the 1920s and 30s, biologist Russell Earl Forster was wondering whether the increased fish from hatcheries actually resulted in more fish returning in the annual salmon run. He collected data over 12 years looking at sockeye populations in Cultus Lake, BC. When he published his findings between 1926 and 1938, he discovered that even though hatchery fish had a higher egg survival rate, by the time they were released, they were significantly worse off than their wild counterparts. A hypothesis for this trend is that hatchery fish lack the skills to find prey on their own, and thus have a higher mortality rate than wild populations once they're released. Thus, there weren't actually that many more salmon in the ocean, and this actually convinced Canada to stop publicly funding hatcheries in 1937. By the 1970s, though, hatcheries were given a second chance with the SEP, but this led to even more problems for wild populations. With more and more industrial-style fish farms, lots and lots of salmon are crammed together in tight spaces. Additionally, with thousands of fish from just a few parents, there's not a lot of genetic diversity in hatchery populations. This makes hatcheries a perfect breeding ground for pathogens and parasites. This is because, according to the SIR model, if you increase the density of susceptible individuals, you will increase the transmittance of that pathogen. Additionally, because of the low genetic diversity, if one individual lacks the fitness to fight off the disease or parasite, almost all of them will also die because they're all so genetically similar. This is like how species that reproduce asexually are at a high risk of extinction because of susceptibility to parasites. In the same way, hatchery populations have a high chance of extinction if humans were to stop caring for them as intensively. What's even more so is if the hatchery fish do survive, they can interbreed with the wild populations, which can reduce the fitness and genetic diversity of those populations as well, which can further lead to lower population sizes, exactly opposite the point of hatcheries. And so we still see populations declining for most salmon species, such as a 60% reduction in Chinook populations since 1984. And so, with salmon populations still on the decline and ecosystem services threatened, where do we go from here? Is it possible for their populations to bounce back while still meeting the demands for salmon?
Part 4.
What happens next?
It may be tempting to think that what's best for salmon restoration is to remove as much human influence as possible. But that's neither realistic nor necessary. Indigenous communities have hunted salmon for at least 5,000 years, and during that time, salmon populations stayed consistent and healthy until settlers arrived. This is because indigenous communities focus not on breeding more, but rather maintaining salmon habitats. This is done by building spawning beds or by planting trees on the shore to shade and cool the water. Moreover, indigenous fishing techniques are always selective, meaning that they can release individuals from more vulnerable populations. This is unlike ocean trawlers, where salmon from multiple populations are all taken all at once. Some conservation experts are therefore calling for fewer salmon to actually be produced and instead put more of a focus on habitat maintenance. And some organizations are adopting some of these changes too. Here at Hoy Creek, the hatchery staff also put a focus on protecting the waterway by clearing invasive species, planting native trees, and cleaning up the stream. Now there are other threats to salmon populations too, such as climate change, which seems to have a stronger effect on some species than others. Notably, pink salmon seem to be doing much better than coho and chinook salmon in the warmer waters, though not a lot of research has been done to explore why. One suggestion, though, is that pink salmon may be stronger competitors for catching smaller fish, a shared food source, in warmer waters. Then, according to the Lotka-Volterra model, if the competitive effect of pink salmon on other species increases due to warmer waters, then that can cause a stable equilibrium of species to evolve into one where coho and chinook are completely excluded. Thus, if you weren't convinced already, another reason to support climate change mitigation is to protect the diversity of salmon populations. And by maintaining the sizes and diversity of salmon populations in BC, they can continue to provide all the services that they do. To sum up, salmon are incredibly important ecologically and culturally. Thus, humans and salmon have interacted with each other in what is now BC since time immemorial, and many technologies have been developed to catch and rear salmon. Salmon hatcheries were introduced in response to declining populations from commercial fishing and habitat degradation. But hatcheries were actually shown to be harmful to most wild populations, threatening the entire ecosystem. And finally, with threats like pathogens, loss of genetic diversity, climate change, and more, perhaps incorporating more traditional style fisheries and changing the narrative around salmon enhancement can actually help the populations bounce back. I'd like to say a huge thank you to the Hoy Scott Watershed Society for helping me with some of my research. And I'd like to thank you for watching and learning with me and Alvin today. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time on
Science with Thomas.